To begin the conversation, I want you to explain to parents the impact of stress and how it's manifested. So some parents might have an idea that, a child might lash out, but they might not understand the various ways stress might be manifested in their children. So can you just explain that to parents so that they can, have an idea of maybe how they can assess their child?
That is actually a great place to start. We sort of assume that it is obvious to us when our child is or our teen is overstressed. And of course, in many cases it is. But in far more cases, it is not at all obvious. What I mean by that is that stress really works deep inside the human body. It works at the level of cellular change and certain metabolic processes. And we can have a child who is overstressed, yet not demonstrate in their behavior any of the sort of glaring signs that we associate with being overstressed. So let me give you an example. One of the things we did at our institute was we looked at kids that we suspected were overstressed, but weren't showing it in their behavior or in their mood or even in their schooling. But what happens when you sort of look below the surface? And by that, what I mean is when you start to study what's happening in the brain, what's happening physiologically, what you discover is that this kid is actually in what we call heightened sympathetic arousal. What that means is that their brain, normally when we look at a child's brain, when they're, nice and calm and not overstressed, we see nice, slow waves. But when a child is hyperaroused, the waves look like this. They're very rapid. They have what's called greater amplitude. So we can see what's called cortical arousal, how the brain is working very hard, even though the child doesn't show it. Now, if we look at the physiological side, we might find that the child's heart is actually beating faster than we would regard as normal, or their blood pressure is a little high. We can do a little simple test where we can measure the stress response in terms of electrical signals on their skin. So what we find is that a child can be overstressed, whatever that means, yet not actually showing it, not actually demonstrating it in a really, overt way. However, if all this is going on, if the child has this state which is called heightened sympathetic arousal, what that means is that kid is burning an awful lot of energy. And that energy consumption is going to have an impact on things like the child's immune system, on the child's digestion, and then eventually on the child's mood or learning. So this is an important point. We have to learn how to detect the signs of hyperarousal, hyperstress, before it leads to a bigger problem down the road. And that's literally what we do for a living, right? Figuring out what are those kinds of signs. So that's my first point. So my first point is to mom and dad, if your kid is showing all the signs of being overstressed, like they're very depressed or anxious, okay, so then we have to start right away to do self-reg. But even if they're not showing those signs, the kid may be overstressed. And so we have to figure out what are the more subtle signs, and then what do we do?
And what are some of those subtle signs that parents might want to look out for? You mentioned that it might change their digestive system. So could it be their eating habits change,
Yes.
sleep patterns, and so
Yes.
on? Yes.
Yes. Yes, that's a good one. And So let's stick with that for 1 second. If we find our child drawn to basically sugar, salt, and fat, so processed foods, and resisting eating, healthy foods, instead of saying, well, my kid is just a picky eater, we really want to ask why. Why is he having or she having trouble eating properly? Why are they drawn to things like, well, let's take an example, which is a very interesting one. We are seeing this incredible shift in the last 20 years from children drinking primarily water to children drinking sweetened drinks, sweetened fruit juice or pop. But for physiologists, that is actually classified as a stress. It's a physiological stress. What do we mean by that? Well, what we mean is that there's a little system deep in the brain that monitors blood glucose, how much sugar's in your bloodstream. And if there's too much sugar in the bloodstream, that's actually toxic. It can actually destroy brain cells. So obviously we have to get rid of that excess glucose. So this system that's deep inside the brain, what it does is it triggers a safety response, and other organs start, such as the pancreas, start to work really hard to get rid of that extra glucose, to get us back into that safety zone. So in this case, the soft drink is actually stressing. In the narrow definition of the term, a stress is anything that requires us to burn energy. So it is stressing their physiology. Now, there's a point that arises from this that for parents is absolutely fundamental. And that is, we distinguish in self-reg between maladaptive ways of dealing with stress and growth promoting ways of dealing with stress. So what's a maladaptive way? Well, a maladaptive way is the kid is overstressed, maybe knows it, maybe doesn't, and keeps himself going with pop. But that's maladaptive. And it's maladaptive because we only have so much energy. We only have so much glucose. And so we are now spending a lot of our glucose to get rid of the extra sugar, whether it's pop or sugary treats, or even processed foods these days. So now the problem is that the child is burning so much energy to get rid of the extra sugar that there's not enough energy left for proper digestion, or the immune system, etc. So here's a classic example of how just the way my child eats, when my child eats, what my child wants to eat, what my child is drawn to, if they are drawn to that quick shot of sugar, of energy, that's a sign that A, they are under a lot of stress, and B, they're dealing with that stress in what we call a maladaptive way, meaning that it may help them in this moment, but it's going to create even greater stress down the road. So that's a couple of fundamental points.
Yes, that is fascinating because I don't think parents understand that. And especially when you said, oh, my child is a picky eater. Yes. There are lots of parents who have said that, not realizing that there's a possibility that their child could experience stress and is using the sugary food to feel better. So if a parent listening realize that my child is picky and gravitates towards the sodas, the processed foods, the chips, the pizzas, and so on, and that's all they want to eat. They don't want to eat the vegetables and the fruits. How then do they make that shift? Nutrition is one thing, but are there any other strategies they can implement or teach their children to help them to handle stress in an adaptive way so that it will indirectly or directly influence their appetite and nutritional needs?
That is really a wonderful question. Um, Now, we are, as a culture, we are drawn to a self-control mindset. And that means what we're going to do is, if I'm a parent and I've heard Shanker today, well, I'm going to insist that you cannot eat any of these foods, and I'm going to be like an army sergeant, and I'm going to keep a strict watch on what you're consuming. And now what we've done is we've turned eating into a family stress, a stress for the child and a stress for mom and dad. So instead, what we want to do is self-regulation. Self-regulation, I mentioned before, really just refers to how we manage stress. So the first point here is the most important. If my child is having trouble with a healthy diet, that actually tells me that the child's stress load is way too high. Now I have to become a stress detective. What it means is my child has all sorts of stresses in their life that maybe we weren't aware are stresses. So we developed these what are called stress inventories to help parents. And they can download that, by the way, off our website for free. There are hundreds of different kinds of stresses, and we boiled them down to 5 groups. So we did factor analysis. We came up with 5 groups of stress: physical, emotional, social, cognitive, and prosocial. The lesson here is that if I am seeing a sign that my child is overstressed, such as bad eating habits, instead of fixating on that one issue, I'm now going to try to figure out what are all the stresses that my kid is dealing with. What is the total amount of stress? If I can lower that stress load, then the child or teen's impulse need for that quick fix diminishes. So what we're doing is, instead of trying to control the behavior, we're trying to figure out what led to the behavior. And what led to the behavior is too much stress.